Before we begin, you need to understand what it means to trade one addiction for another. This is not a story about recovery. It's not a story about medical breakthroughs or the triumph of modern pharmacology. This is the story of how a synthetic opioid, created in the laboratories of Nazi Germany to fuel a war machine, became the cornerstone of America's approach to heroin addiction, and how that solution, that cure, now kills more people each year than the disease it was meant to treat. The numbers are stark. By the early 2020s, methadone was responsible for more than 5,000 deaths annually in the United States. 5,000 lives ended by a drug that was supposed to save them. In some years, methadone overdoses exceeded heroin overdoses. Let that settle for a moment. The treatment killed more than the affliction. But before we go further, I need something from you. If you're finding value in this exploration of buried history, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and in the comments, tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. These stories take time to research and craft, and your engagement helps ensure more of them get told. Phone away now. Distractions silenced. We have a long journey ahead. The central tragedy of methadone is linguistic as much as pharmaceutical. We call it treatment. The medical establishment calls it maintenance. Critics call it substitution. These words matter. They shape how we understand what's really happening. Treatment implies cure, an endpoint, a return to health. Maintenance suggests indefinite management of a chronic condition. Substitution is the most honest. It acknowledges we're simply replacing one opioid with another. Street drug for state-sanctioned drug. Illegal dependency for legal dependency. We replaced one chemical prison with another, more regulated one, and called it progress. This is a story about good intentions meeting the immutable realities of opioid pharmacology. It's about medical hubris, institutional inertia, and the distance between policy and lived experience. It's about the thousands of people who entered methadone clinics seeking freedom from heroin and found themselves bound to a different molecule, a different routine, a different form of captivity. Some found stability, some found slow death, many found both. And it's about how we, as a society, as a medical system, as architects of drug policy, consistently choose control over care, management over healing, the appearance of solution over the hard work of actual support. The drug itself is neither villain nor savior. It's a molecule, a synthetic mu-opioid receptor agonist with a long half-life and high binding affinity. What matters is how we've used it, what systems we've built around it, what promises we've made, and what consequences we've ignored. To understand how we arrived at this tragedy, we must travel back to 1937, to Frankfurt, Germany, to the laboratories of IG Farben, where chemists worked for a regime preparing for war. In the beginning, there was a number, not a name, not a brand, not a promise, just a code, penciled onto paper in a laboratory where the air smelled faintly of solvents and warm glass. Host 10820, a cold label for a molecule that would outlive the uniforms and flags of the men who first shaped it. In Frankfurt on Main, where the River Main slid past stone embankments and the city's skyline bristled with cranes and smokestacks, the German chemical giant IG Farben stood like a second government, vast, technical, self-assured. Its headquarters, completed in 1931, was all long curves and pale stone, an architecture of modern confidence that would later be seized by the Allies in 1945 and turned into a command post for the Figbers. Even buildings in the 20th century could be repurposed overnight. Image: IG Farben Building, Frankfurt, completed 1931. But before the war's end, before the ruins and the tribunals, there was the slow, methodical work of chemists. In 1937, within the orbit of IG Farben's host division, two German chemists, Max Bockmuehl and Gustav Erhardt, were deep in the industrial pursuit of synthetic pain relief, following a decades-long research lineage that had already produced modern drugs and modern illusions of mastery over suffering. Their work yielded a compound cataloged as VA-10820, later associated with the earlier serial Host 10820, and eventually sold under the name Polymethodone, an echo of relief, a linguistic bandage for something far more potent than the word suggests. Image: Gustav Erhardt portrait photograph. Image: Max Bockmuehl portrait photograph. To understand why a new opioid mattered in 1937, you have to understand the anxiety of empires. Germany, in the tightening grip of the Nazi state, was preparing for a war it could not openly admit was inevitable. In 1936, Adolf Hitler announced the Four-Year Plan, a national mandate aimed at economic,
industrial self-sufficiency, autarky,
so that the nation could fight without dependence. That included fuel, rubber, chemicals, and the quiet necessities of modern armies: analgesics, sedatives, the medical logistics of keeping bodies functioning long enough to return to the front. And opium, the ancient source of morphine, came from places Germany could not guarantee access to once the world closed its doors. Supply chains were vulnerabilities. Ports could be blockaded. Crops could be denied. A laboratory, by contrast, could be guarded. So Host 10820 was not born from humanitarian idealism. It was born from strategic panic, dressed in a white coat, a substitute for a plant, engineered to be reliable, synthetic, long-acting, potent, a compound that, in modern pharmacology, is recognized as a fully synthetic opioid agonist, binding the same mu-opioid receptors that morphine and heroin touch, but doing so with a persistence that can feel almost architectural, hours stacked upon hours, pain muted not in a flash, but in a slow, heavy settling. And around this quiet scientific ambition was the darker machinery that made such ambition possible. IG Farben was not merely a company. It was the largest chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate in Europe, an industrial organism that grew fat on state contracts and became in the 1940s one of the great enablers of the Third Reich. It purged Jewish employees after the Nazi takeover in 1933. It donated to the Nazi cause. It produced materials crucial to war, and it relied on enslaved human beings, tens of thousands, forced into labor from the Auschwitz complex, including the Monowitz camp, where IG Farben built its Buna plant in the shadow of mass death. The numbers are not abstract. They are a census of suffering. There is a particular kind of moral dissonance that only industrial modernity can produce, the same conglomerate that could refine dyes and pharmaceuticals, that could speak the language of innovation and progress, could also be interwoven with the Holocaust. One of IG Farben's subsidiaries supplied Cyanon B, the cyanide-based poison used to murder over 1 million people in gas chambers, a pesticide repurposed into genocide, a commodity transformed into a ritual of killing. The molecule did not care what it was used for. The humans did, or chose not to. It is here, in this institutional shadow, that Host 10820 begins to feel less like a drug and more like a symbol, an artifact of authoritarian pragmatism, a tool engineered for control over pain, and by extension, control over bodies. In wartime, painkillers are not just medicine. They are logistics. They are morale. They are the thin chemical thread that can keep a soldier conscious, compliant, functional. Yet the historical record complicates the legend that often follows methadone's origin story. According to historical reviews of the drug's development, VA 10820 was tested pharmacologically in earnest only by early 1942, with clinical tests following in the autumn of 1942, and it was provided to the Wehrmacht under the codename Amidon for additional testing, though evidence suggests it was not supplied or used in appreciable quantities during World War II, and it was not approved for commercial production during the war years. Even in a nation desperate for substitutes, morphine and other established analgesics remained preferred, while this new compound lingered as an experiment, a possibility, a file in an archive. The drug was born but not yet celebrated. Picture, if you will, a military hospital somewhere behind the lines. White sheets, the metallic clink of instruments, the low murmur of nurses moving through dim corridors. Outside, winter air bites at broken masonry. Inside, pain is everywhere. Shrapnel wounds, amputations, burns, infection. Medicine in war is triage and compromise. A nurse's hands smell of antiseptic. A doctor's eyes are hollow from too many nights without sleep. In such rooms, the question is never philosophical. It is immediate. How do you keep him alive? How do you keep him quiet? How do you keep the war machine moving? Image, Wehrmacht Field Hospital medical equipment photograph. Host 10820, Polymidon, Amidon, the name shifting like a shadow, belonged to that logic, not mercy but function, not comfort but continuity. And then, as the war ground toward its end, the institutions that created such compounds began to collapse under the weight of what they had done. In 1945, IG Farben was seized by the Allies. Its directors later tried in the IG Farben trial of 1947-1948, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings. The corporate body that once seemed immortal was suddenly a defendant. But molecules do not stand trial. They simply persist, waiting in drawers, waiting in patents, waiting to be rediscovered by new hands with new narratives. When the war ended and the Allied forces occupied Germany, they found pharmaceutical patents. When the war ended and the Allied forces occupied Germany, they discovered more than concentration camps and weapons. They found pharmaceutical patents, stacked like silent trophies, a paper empire of formulas and trade names that could be boxed, stamped, and shipped like anything else in the new order. In 1945, the victorious powers did not only dismantle armies, they dismantled knowledge. Across the American zone, files and sample jars moved under guard, the way art and gold had moved in older wars, except now the treasure was chemistry. Thousands of industrial secrets once protected by a regime that had sworn it would never be dependent again. The United States had mechanisms for this kind of appropriation. Through wartime and post-war seizure systems, names like the Office of Alien Property Custodian echoing through bureaucratic corridors, enemy property could be frozen, requisitioned, and repurposed. In a century of total war, even ideas could be treated as spoils. Somewhere in that flood of confiscated research sat a compound first born as VAR 10820, later whispered through code names and provisional labels. Not famous, not celebrated, just potent. U.S. investigators studying German chemical records would later note that the research files from I.G. Farben's hoaxed works were confiscated by American authorities and brought back for analysis, sifted by committees and intelligence offices hungry to translate Axis science into Allied advantage. The molecule itself did not carry a flag. It simply waited in the documentation, a long-acting promise hidden inside technical language. Picture the scene, slow and clinical. A desk lamp in a government office throwing light onto German-language reports, the faint rasp of paper, a hand drawing a line under a formula, a specimen vial sealed, labeled, shipped. Outside, cities are rebuilding, Frankfurt streets still raw, Indianapolis humming with American industrial confidence. The war is over, but the appetite for advantage has not ended. It has simply changed its clothing. By 1947, the compound had crossed an ocean and acquired a new identity. The American Medical Association's Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry gave it the generic name methadone, stripping away its coded German past and making it sound like any other modern drug, manufactured, standardized, clean. In the same year, U.S. commercial production began, led by Eli Lilly, one of the pharmaceutical companies ready to turn seized knowledge into product. And here the story gains its sharp post-war irony. A molecule shaped in the shadow of Nazi industrial power would be refashioned into an American medicine, marketed under a new banner. The brand name they chose carried its own mythology, Dolafine. The syllables sounded almost like a confession, almost like an invocation. And soon, in clinics and whispered conversations, an urban legend took root, that it was named after Adolf Hitler, that the drug carried his ghost in its very label. The story spread because it felt plausible, because people crave symbols when faced with something frightening. But the truth is quieter and more mundane. Historical accounts trace Dolafine not to Hitler at all, but to Latin roots, dolor, pain, and finis, end, an engineered meaning meant to soothe physicians and patients alike. The myth persisted anyway, because myths are sticky, and because in medicine, as in war, the narrative often outlives the facts. In the United States, methadone did not arrive wearing the moral language of treatment or redemption. It arrived as an analgesic, positioned for severe chronic pain, cases where the body had been carved by surgery, where cancer gnawed through nerve and bone, where ordinary relief failed and the physician needed something heavy, something dependable. It was also approved in 1947 for analgesic and antitussives, a reminder that the first official American framing of methadone was not addiction care at all, but ordinary medicine, the management of pain and cough under the broad umbrella of post-war pharmacology. And methadone's chemistry made it both alluring and dangerous. Unlike shorter-acting opioids that flare and fade, methadone lingers. Its half-life can stretch long, often described in ranges like 24 to 36 hours, so that doses can accumulate, layering effect upon effect, especially when early prescribers did not yet fully respect how slowly it leaves the body. There's a particular kind of calm that comes from a drug that doesn't hurry, a slow tide rather than a crashing wave, but with that slow tide can come the undertow, sedation, cumulative intoxication, and in some individuals a potent euphoria that is less traumatic than heroin's lightning strike, but more enduring, more capable of quietly reshaping desire. The American medical community's reception was from the beginning mixed. This was not a miracle drug descending into a great nation. It was a new tool entering a crowded cabinet filled with morphine and codeine and the hard-earned caution of physicians who had watched dependence take root in patients who never intended to become prisoners of a prescription. In the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, medical discussion of opioids was already haunted by the memory of earlier narcotic cycles, by the legal crackdown on maintenance ideas, and by the moral suspicion that clung to any drug that could soothe too well. The seeds of concern were there, early, even if the culture had not yet developed a modern language for opioid use disorder. And that is why methadone was not initially used for addiction treatment. The concept itself, long-term opioid maintenance as a therapeutic strategy, had not yet been accepted as legitimate American medicine. The shadow of the Harrison-era clampdowns and the closing of morphine clinics still lingered over the profession, shaping what could be imagined, what could be funded, what could be spoken aloud in respectable rooms. Methadone, in those years, was simply another analgesic with a troubling personality, effective, long-acting, and capable of dependence. So the paradox settles in. A drug born in the logic of wartime control was adopted through post-war conquest and profit motive, then folded into American clinical practice with a kind of confident forgetfulness. The molecule's origin story was filed away, the new label was printed, the shelves were stocked. The United States, in its post-war exceptionalism, could claim it had transformed enemy science into civilized medicine, yet the substance itself remained indifferent, waiting for the next era to tell it what it was for. For nearly 2 decades, methadone remained in medicine's shadows, a powerful but unremarkable painkiller. Then came the 1960s, and America's cities began to burn. In the 1960s, methadone was still a quiet name in a quiet drawer, but outside the clinic walls, the country was no longer quiet, and New York City was beginning to sound like a warning siren that never turned off. This was the decade of polished speeches and televised moonshots, yes, but it was also the decade of boarded windows, burnt-out hallways, and a particular kind of street-level grief that never made it into commemorative photographs. In Harlem, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, in the South Bronx, and parts of the Lower East Side, addiction did not arrive as a moral debate. It arrived as a daily weather, the kind that seeped into stairwells and schoolyards, into the rhythm of families who began to measure time not in birthdays, but in arrests, in overdoses, and the next sick morning. And by the mid-1960s, prevailing calculations for New York's heroin-using population would later be described as staggering, 150,000 to 300,000 people, a figure so large it began to feel less like a statistic and more like an occupying force. Heroin did not emerge from nowhere. It rode the supply lines of the post-war world, where borders could be patrolled but never sealed, and where demand in American cities created an economic gravity that pulled product across oceans. In the popular imagination, the French Connection became a single phrase for a sprawling pipeline, opium grown in Turkey, moved and refined in places like Marseille, then shipped into North America, feeding the hunger of distant streets. A global commodity chain, as cold and efficient as any legitimate industry, except its product was forgetfulness in powder form. And the city had places that became symbols. Sherman Square on the Upper West Side, later immortalized as Needle Park, was one of them, a patch of public space where addiction became visible enough for cameras, journalists, and frightened commuters to finally look straight at it. The nickname itself was a confession, a park defined not by trees or benches, but by syringes. The panic did not stay contained to the people using drugs. It spread outward, to parents on the subway, to landlords, to politicians watching their approval ratings wobble. The fear reached the suburbs, where the crisis could be discussed as something invading from the city, even as the city's own residents had been living inside it for years. Image, Sherman Square, Verde Square, Sherman Square area, later nicknamed Needle Park. Image, Needle Park era photograph, Upper West Side context. The suffering was plain. Overdoses, abscessed arms, the slow collapse of appetite and sleep, the frantic hunt for money that turned ordinary people into burglars, hustlers, and informants. Children learning far too early how to step around bodies slumped in hallways, mothers locking purses inside cupboards, fathers disappearing behind prison walls. And this mattered. The people bearing the brunt were disproportionately from minority communities, already targeted by aggressive enforcement, already denied stable housing, jobs, and healthcare, then blamed for the chaos that followed. The crisis was not evenly distributed. It never is. The official responses, at first, were a gallery of failure dressed up as policy. There was the oldest ritual of all, punishment. Arrests and raids, court calendars swelling, jails filling with the same faces, the same sick bodies cycling through withdrawal in cells that smelt of sweat and bleach. There were abstinence-only approaches, sermons, and redemption narratives that demanded a transformation of the soul before offering relief to the body. There were programs that promised discipline through humiliation, belonging through obedience, a kind of salvation by social pressure. And then there was the federal experiment that had once seemed like the rational answer, the Lexington narcotic farm in Kentucky, the strange hybrid of prison and hospital where addicts were detoxed, studied, and released back into the world. It was a place that embodied the mid-century belief that if you could just isolate the addict long enough, dry them out, feed them, work them, counsel them, the disease would loosen its grip. But reality was brutal. Several studies found that 90% or more of those released from Lexington soon relapsed. The numbers were devastating, not because they were surprising, but because they confirmed what the streets already knew. Withdrawal was not the same thing as recovery. Even the success stories carried shadows. A man could come out of detox glowing with relief, clean skin and steady hands, only to walk back into the neighborhood and feel the old cues reawaken like muscle memory. The corner, the friend, the empty pocket, the familiar ache. In the controlled world of an institution, abstinence was possible. In the living world, it was fragile. Meanwhile, another force tightened the noose, the Vietnam War. By 1970 and 1971, drug use among U.S. troops was no longer a rumor. It was documented, debated, and feared. Reports described marijuana, psychedelics, and hard drugs circulating in the theaters of war, while heroin, odorless, portable, efficient, became part of the landscape for some soldiers as the conflict dragged on and morale frayed. The United States began to imagine a nightmare scenario, thousands of addicted servicemen returning home, carrying a habit back to their towns and cities like a second infection after the war. Image. Photo illustrating Vietnam-era concern about drug use among troops. So by the middle to late 1960s, New York's leadership was trapped between two ugly truths. First, the human cost was real, not theatrical. People were dying, families were breaking, communities were fraying. Second, the tools available were almost medieval: moral judgment, confinement, forced abstinence, and the hope that fear would do what medicine could not. Political pressure became its own kind of weather system. Mayor John V. Lindsay, taking office on January 1, 1966, faced a city in overlapping crises, where drugs were not isolated from crime, poverty, and the public's growing sense that the social contract was cracking. Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller, too, demanded solutions, speaking in the hard language of law and order, even as treatment programs struggled, and critics argued about what actually worked and what only sounded strong in press conferences. When leaders argue in public, it is often because they are privately afraid. Image. Mayor John V. Lindsay, public portrait. And the medical community, especially physicians watching this unfold in New York, felt an older frustration returning. They had scalpels and antibiotics. They could set broken bones and remove tumors, but addiction mocked their tools. For decades, American narcotic policy had narrowed the space in which doctors could even imagine maintenance treatment, haunted by the memory of earlier crackdowns on morphine clinics and the fear of being accused of trafficking rather than healing. That history mattered. It shaped what was politically palatable and what was professionally dangerous. In this atmosphere, every failed approach amplified desperation. Cold turkey detox meant suffering followed by relapse. Prison meant suffering followed by relapse. Strict, confrontational communities could produce temporary obedience, but often at the price of autonomy, dignity, and sometimes safety. The city needed something that could be defended not as surrender, but as strategy, something that sounded scientific enough to quiet skeptics, controlled enough to satisfy police, and practical enough to reduce the daily churn of theft, withdrawal, and overdose. And behind it all was the question that haunted every serious doctor who refused easy moralism, a question that felt almost obscene to ask out loud because it sounded like betrayal. Can you treat addiction with another opioid? This was not manufactured panic. It was not a headline looking for a story. It was a genuine emergency, measured in funerals, in frightened families, in neighborhoods where the ordinary rituals of life were being slowly replaced by the rituals of dependence. And when a society reaches that point, it becomes willing to experiment. It becomes willing to redefine what treatment even means. Into this chaos stepped two doctors with a controversial idea. What if we fought fire with fire? What if we replaced heroin with something legal, something controlled, something permanent? The results were impressive enough, and in a city drowning in desperation, impressive enough was all it took. In 1964, Dr. Vincent Dole commuted to work from Rye, a wealthy suburb north of New York City, driving past neighborhoods that had become open-air heroin markets. The route took him to Rockefeller University Hospital, where he had spent 20 years studying metabolism and obesity, safe, respectable research that kept him comfortably ensconced in the world of academic medicine. Born to a prosperous Chicago family in 1913, educated at Stanford and Harvard Medical School, Dole had the kind of background that insulated people from America's grittier problems. But in 1962, while serving as acting chairman of the Health Research Council of the City of New York, those problems had forced their way into his consciousness. New York was drowning. Heroin overdose had become the leading cause of death among New Yorkers under age 35. The city's jails overflowed with addicts. Crime had metastasized into something unrecognizable, and the medical establishment had nothing to offer except moral condemnation and the revolving door of detoxification. Dole made a decision that shocked his colleagues. He would change the focus of his laboratory from obesity to heroin addiction. He would approach addiction not as a moral failing, but as a metabolic disease, something broken in the body's chemistry that could potentially be fixed. To help him, he recruited Dr. Marie Neiswander, a psychiatrist who had spent years in the trenches of addiction treatment. Where Dole came from privilege and laboratory science, Niswander came from the streets of Harlem and the smoke-filled rooms where jazz musicians struggled with their demons. After graduating from Cornell Medical School in 1944 and serving in the Navy, she had been posted to the Lexington Narcotic Hospital. The experience had radicalized her. In the 1950s, Niswander had established her own practice treating addicts, many of them musicians from New York's creative scene. She worked with them not as criminals, but as patients deserving of medical care and dignity. In 1955, she helped launch the Narcotic Addiction Research Project, an outpatient program that used psychotherapy. The next year, she published The Drug Addict as Patient, a book that challenged every orthodoxy of its time by insisting that addicts could be helped, that they were sick rather than wicked. But by 1964, Niswander had grown disillusioned. Psychotherapy alone wasn't working. The relapse rates were devastating. She had watched talented musicians, people with families and careers and futures, throw everything away chasing the next fix. Something fundamental was missing from the treatment approach. When Dole invited her to join his research project at Rockefeller University Hospital, she accepted. Together, they developed a theory that was radical for its time and remains controversial even now. They proposed that chronic heroin use creates a permanent metabolic change in the body, a fundamental rewiring of brain chemistry. In their view, addiction wasn't a choice or a character flaw. It was a physiological condition like diabetes or hypothyroidism. The addict's body had been permanently altered by prolonged opiate exposure, and it now required an opioid to function normally. If that was true, then abstinence was not a realistic goal, at least not initially, and perhaps not ever. Asking a heroin addict to quit cold turkey was like asking a diabetic to will their pancreas into producing insulin. The solution, they believed, was to provide a legal substitute that would normalize the disrupted brain chemistry, allowing the person to function without the chaos of street drugs. The substitute they chose was methadone, a synthetic opioid developed in Germany in the late 1930s. Methadone had been used as a painkiller and occasionally for short-term detoxification. But Dole and Niswander envisioned something different. Not detox, not abstinence, maintenance. Indefinite, possibly lifelong maintenance on a daily dose of methadone that would satisfy the body's craving for opioids without producing euphoria, without requiring injection, without the desperate hunt for dealers and money. In early 1964, they began their first clinical trials at Rockefeller Hospital. The initial cohort consisted of 22 male patients carefully selected. These were not random addicts pulled from the streets. They were people who had been addicted to heroin for a median of 9.5 years, people who had tried to quit and failed repeatedly, people who met specific criteria and received intensive support services alongside them.
Medication. Dole and Niswander weren't just handing out pills. They were providing counseling, job training, medical care, a comprehensive program wrapped around the pharmacological intervention. The results seemed miraculous. Within months, patients who had spent years injecting heroin multiple times a day were stabilized on a single oral dose of methadone taken each morning. They stopped seeking heroin. They stopped committing crimes to pay for drugs. They returned to work. They reconnected with families. Some began taking college courses. The transformation was so dramatic that even Dole and Niswander seemed astonished by what they had unleashed. In 1965, they published their first paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a medical treatment for diacetylmorphine, heroin, addiction. The language was cautious, scientific, but the implications were revolutionary. By 1966, they were presenting more data, more success stories. In 1968, they published results from 750 criminal addicts. The reported success rate hovered above 80%. Patients holding jobs, patients staying out of jail, patients living stable, productive lives. The city of New York, desperate for any solution to the heroin epidemic ravaging its streets, embraced methadone maintenance with the fervor of the converted. Funding flowed from the Rockefeller Foundation, from city government, from federal agencies suddenly interested in this new approach. The program expanded rapidly. By the end of the 1960s, Beth Israel Medical Center alone had 1,000 patients under treatment. The model spread to other cities. The seductive simplicity of it appealed to policymakers and police departments alike. One pill daily, no more chasing dealers, no more overdoses in alleyways. Problem solved. But even then, questions emerged. Quiet at first, then growing louder. What exactly did success mean in this context? The patients weren't obstinate. They were taking an opioid every single day, indefinitely, possibly for the rest of their lives. They had traded an illegal dependency for a legal one. Was that treatment, or was it simply substitution, swapping one addiction for another with a prescription pad as the intermediary? Dole and Niswander argued that this was precisely the point. In their metabolic disease model, the body needed the opioid. Providing it through methadone allowed the person to function normally, free from the chaos and criminality of street heroin.
But critics, and there were many even then, saw something troubling in the equation. This wasn't recovery in any traditional sense. This was management. This was accepting that the person would remain dependent on an opioid, perhaps forever, and calling that success because the dependency was legal and controlled. There were other problems lurking beneath the surface of those impressive statistics. The initial cohort of 22 patients had been carefully selected. They received intensive support services that would never scale to a mass treatment program. The published results didn't dwell on how difficult it was to stop taking methadone once you started. Methadone withdrawal, it turned out, was longer and more brutal than heroin withdrawal. The body that had been metabolically altered by heroin, then stabilized on methadone, did not easily relinquish its need for opioids. Patients who tried to taper off methadone often relapsed, not because they were weak, but because the pharmacology of long-acting opioids creates a dependency that is extraordinarily difficult to break. Were the results cherry-picked? Were the success rates inflated by exclusion patients who dropped out or relapsed? These questions would haunt methadone maintenance for decades, but in 1965 and 1966, in a city where heroin overdose was the leading cause of death for young people, such questions seemed almost beside the point. Something was working. Patients were alive. Families were reuniting. Crime was falling in neighborhoods where methadone clinics opened. Dole and Niswander were believers, true believers. They genuinely thought they had discovered a medical solution to a medical problem. They saw the human suffering up close, the patients who came to them broken and desperate, and they saw those same patients transform into functional members of society. The philosophical question they sidestepped, whether lifelong opioid maintenance constituted recovery, seemed abstract compared to the concrete reality of lives being saved. But they had unleashed something they didn't fully understand. A treatment modality that would become entangled with politics, with crime policy, with the machinery of the drug war. A program that would save lives and also create new forms of dependency and control. The best intentions of harm reduction meeting the reality of opioid pharmacology, and the result was something more complicated than either triumph or tragedy. It was both. It was neither. The results were impressive enough, and in a city drowning in desperation, impressive enough was all it took. Within 5 years, methadone would spread across America. The results were impressive enough, and in a city drowning in desperation, impressive enough was all it took. In 1964, Dr. Vincent Dole commuted to work from Rye, a wealthy suburb north of New York City, driving past neighborhoods that had become open-air heroin markets. The route took him to Rockefeller University Hospital, where he had spent 20 years studying metabolism and obesity, safe, respectable research that kept him comfortably ensconced in the world of academic medicine. Born to a prosperous Chicago family in 1913, educated at Stanford and Harvard Medical School, Dole had the kind of background that insulated people from America's grittier problems. But in 1962, while serving as acting chairman of the Health Research Council of the City of New York, those problems had forced their way into his consciousness. New York was drowning. Heroin overdose had become the leading cause of death among New Yorkers under age 35. The city's jails overflowed with addicts. Crime had metastasized into something unrecognizable, and the medical establishment had nothing to offer except moral condemnation and the revolving door of detoxification. Dole made a decision that shocked his colleagues. He would change the focus of his laboratory from obesity to heroin addiction. He would approach addiction not as a moral failing, but as a metabolic disease, something broken in the body's chemistry that could potentially be fixed. To help him, he recruited Dr. Marie Niswander, a psychiatrist who had spent years in the trenches of addiction treatment. Where Dole came from privilege and laboratory science, Niswander came from the streets of Harlem and the smoke-filled rooms where jazz musicians struggled with their demons. After graduating from Cornell Medical School in 1944 and serving in the Navy, she had been posted to the Lexington Narcotic Hospital. The experience had radicalized her. In the 1950s, Niswander had established her own practice treating addicts, many of them musicians from New York's creative scene. She worked with them not as criminals, but as patients deserving of medical care and dignity. In 1955, she helped launch the Narcotic Addiction Research Project, an outpatient program that used psychotherapy. The next year, she published The Drug Addict as Patient, a book that challenged every orthodoxy of its time by insisting that addicts could be helped, that they were sick rather than wicked. But by 1964, Nicewander had grown disillusioned. Psychotherapy alone wasn't working. The relapse rates were devastating. She had watched talented musicians, people with families and careers and futures, throw everything away chasing the next fix. Something fundamental was missing from the treatment approach. When Dole invited her to join his research project at Rockefeller University Hospital, she accepted. Together they developed a theory that was radical for its time and remains controversial even now. They proposed that chronic heroin use creates a permanent metabolic change in the body, a fundamental rewiring of brain chemistry. In their view, addiction wasn't a choice or a character flaw. It was a physiological condition, like diabetes or hypothyroidism. The addict's body had been permanently altered by prolonged opiate exposure, and it now required an opioid to function normally. If that was true, then abstinence was not a realistic goal, at least not initially, and perhaps not ever. Asking a heroin addict to quit cold turkey was like asking a diabetic to will their pancreas into producing insulin. The solution, they believed, was to provide a legal substitute that would normalize the disrupted brain chemistry, allowing the person to function without the chaos of street trucks. The substitute they chose was methadone, a synthetic opioid developed in Germany in the late 1930s. Methadone had been used as a painkiller and occasionally for short-term detoxification. But Dole and Nicewander envisioned something different. Not detox, not abstinence, maintenance. Indefinite, possibly lifelong maintenance on a daily dose of methadone that would satisfy the body's craving for opioids without producing euphoria, without requiring injection, without the desperate hunt for dealers and money. In early 1964, they began their first clinical trials at Rockefeller Hospital. The initial cohort consisted of 22 male patients, carefully selected. These were not random addicts pulled from the streets. They were people who had been addicted to heroin for a median of 9.5 years, people who had tried to quit and failed repeatedly, people who met specific criteria and received intensive support services alongside the medication. Dole and Nicewander weren't just handing out pills. They were providing counseling, job training, medical care, a comprehensive
program wrapped around the pharmacological intervention. The results seemed miraculous. Within months, patients who had spent years injecting heroin multiple times a day were stabilized on a single oral dose of methadone taken each morning. They stopped seeking heroin. They stopped committing crimes to pay for drugs. They returned to work. They reconnected with families. Some began taking college courses. The transformation was so dramatic that even Dole and Nicewander seemed astonished by what they had unleashed. In 1965, they published their first paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a medical treatment for diacetyl morphine, heroin, addiction. The language was cautious, scientific, but the implications were revolutionary. By 1966, they were presenting more data, more success stories. In 1968, they published results from 750 criminal addicts. The reported success rate hovered above 80%. Patients holding jobs, patients staying out of jail, patients living stable, productive lives. The city of New York, desperate for any solution to the heroin epidemic ravaging its streets, embraced methadone maintenance with the fervor of the converted. Funding flowed from the Rockefeller Foundation, from city government, from federal agencies suddenly interested in this new approach. The program expanded rapidly. By the end of the 1960s, Beth Israel Medical Center alone had 1,000 patients under treatment. The model spread to other cities. The seductive simplicity of it appealed to policymakers and police departments alike. One pill daily. No more chasing dealers. No more overdoses in alleyways. Problem solved. But even then, questions emerged. Quiet at first, then growing louder. What exactly did success mean in this context? The patients weren't abstinent. They were taking an opioid every single day, indefinitely, possibly for the rest of their lives. They had traded an illegal dependency for a legal one. Was that treatment? Or was it simply substitution, swapping one addiction for another with a prescription pad as the intermediary? Dole and Nicewander argued that this was precisely the point. In their metabolic disease model, the body needed the opioid. Providing it through methadone allowed the person to function normally, free from the chaos and criminality of street heroin. But critics, and there were many even then, saw something troubling in the equation. This wasn't recovery in any traditional sense. This was management. This was accepting that the person would remain dependent on an opioid, perhaps forever, and calling that success because the dependency was legal and controlled. There were other problems lurking beneath the surface of those impressive statistics. The initial cohort of 22 patients had been carefully selected.
They received intensive support services that would never scale to a mass treatment program. The published results didn't dwell on how difficult it was to stop taking methadone once you started. Methadone withdrawal, it turned out, was longer and more brutal than heroin withdrawal. The body that had been metabolically altered by heroin, then stabilized on methadone, did not easily relinquish its need for opioids. Patients who tried to taper off methadone often relapsed, not because they were weak, but because the pharmacology of long-acting opioids creates a dependency that is extraordinarily difficult to break. Were the results cherry-picked? Were the success rates inflated by excluding patients who dropped out or relapsed? These questions would haunt methadone maintenance for decades, but in 1965 and 1966, in a city where heroin overdose was the leading cause of death for young people, such questions seemed almost beside the point. Something was working. Patients were alive. Families were reuniting. Crime was falling in neighborhoods where methadone clinics opened. Dole and Niswander were believers, true believers. They genuinely thought they had discovered a medical solution to a medical problem. They saw the human suffering up close, the patients who came to them broken and desperate, and they saw those same patients transform into functional members of society. The philosophical question they sidestepped, whether lifelong opioid maintenance constituted recovery, seemed abstract compared to the concrete reality of lives being saved. But they had unleashed something they didn't fully understand, a treatment modality that would become entangled with politics, with crime policy, with the machinery of the drug war, a program that would save lives and also create new forms of dependency and control. The best intentions of harm reduction meeting the reality of opioid pharmacology, and the result was something more complicated than either triumph or tragedy. It was both. It was neither. The results were impressive enough, and in a city drowning in desperation, impressive enough was all it took. Within 5 years, methadone was
spread across America. Within 5 years, methadone would spread across America, and with that spread came a transformation that Dole and Niswander had never intended, a mutation of their careful experiment into something far larger and far more troubling. The year was 1968. Richard Nixon was campaigning for president on a platform of law and order, promising to restore safety to American streets consumed by what he called an epidemic of crime and drugs. The heroin problem had metastasized beyond New York. It was in Baltimore, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, and the military bases of Vietnam, where young soldiers were returning home with addictions born in the chaos of an unwinnable war. The traditional response, arrest and incarceration, was failing spectacularly. Prisons overflowed. Crime continued. The revolving door spun faster. Nixon needed something new, something that looked like a solution without requiring the difficult work of addressing systemic causes, poverty and racism, and the trauma of a generation sent to die in Southeast Asian jungles. Methadone maintenance offered exactly that, a medical solution, scientific, progressive sounding, a way to declare victory in the drug war without actually winning it. In 1969, the National Institute of Mental Health began pouring federal funding into methadone programs. The trickle became a flood. In 1971, Nixon established the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention, appointing Dr. Jerome Jaffe, a psychiatrist and methadone advocate, to lead it. Jaffe had run a successful methadone program in Illinois. He believed in the model. He convinced Nixon that methadone could be scaled nationally, that it could reduce crime, stabilize neighborhoods, remove addicts from the streets without the political cost of mass incarceration. The expansion was breathtaking in its speed. In 1968, there were perhaps a few thousand patients in methadone programs, nearly all in New York. By 1971, that number had grown to 25,000. By 1973, over 80,000 Americans were enrolled in methadone maintenance programs nationwide. Clinics opened in cities large and small. Some were nonprofit, operated by hospitals or public health departments. Many were for-profit, operated by entrepreneurs who saw opportunity in the combination of federal funding and captive clientele. But something was lost in the translation from Dole and Niswander's original experiment to this national rollout. The careful patient selection disappeared. The intensive support services, the counseling, the job training, the comprehensive wraparound care that had been integral to the Rockefeller University model, these were expensive, difficult to scale, easy to eliminate when the priority was moving as many people as possible from street heroin to clinic methadone as quickly as possible. What remained was the medication itself, dispensed in institutional settings that resembled probation offices more than medical clinics. The clinic experience became a ritual of surveillance and control. Patients, they were called patients, but the treatment bore little resemblance to conventional medical care.
They arrived each morning, often standing in long lines that stretched down city blocks, waiting to enter facilities that were frequently located in the poorest neighborhoods, the same neighborhoods where heroin had devastated communities. Inside, they approached a window, provided identification, submitted to questioning. Then came the dose itself. Liquid methadone, bright red or orange, measured precisely, consumed under direct observation to ensure it was swallowed and not diverted. No privacy, no dignity, just the daily proof of dependency, witnessed and documented. Urine tests became routine, random, frequent. A patient could be called at any time to provide a sample, watched by clinic staff to prevent substitution or tampering. These tests supposedly monitored for continued heroin use, but they also detected alcohol, marijuana, benzodiazepines, anything that might suggest the patient was not following the rules. A positive test could mean reduced dosage, loss of take-home privileges, or discharge from the program entirely, back to the streets and the likelihood of overdose. Take-home doses, the ability to receive several days' worth of methadone at once rather than attending the clinic daily, were presented as rewards for good behavior. Negative urine tests, regular attendance, compliance with counseling sessions that were often perfunctory or non-existent. The system was Pavlovian in its design. Behave and receive the small privilege of not having to report for surveillance every morning. Misbehave and lose even that. The drug that was supposed to normalize brain chemistry became a tool for social control, a mechanism to keep addicts visible, monitored, pacified. Counseling and social services, the elements Dole and Maswander had considered essential, were often inadequate or entirely absent. Clinics were
Overwhelmed. Caseloads ballooned. A single counselor might be responsible for 100 patients or more, making meaningful therapeutic relationships impossible. The focus narrowed to dispensing medication and collecting urine, reducing human beings to data points in a crime reduction strategy. Because that is what methadone had become, not primarily a health intervention, but a crime reduction tool. The success metrics weren't about patients' well-being, their employment, their relationships, their sense of purpose or dignity. The metrics were about arrests, about property crime rates in neighborhoods surrounding clinics, about removing people from the illegal drug market and placing them in a legal one, where their dependency could be managed and monetized. Black Panthers saw it clearly. The Young Lords saw it. Community activists in Harlem and the South Bronx and Watts called it what it was: chemical genocide. A program that took Black and Latino addicts, people whose drug use was often a response to systemic oppression and economic abandonment, and placed them in a permanent state of supervised dependency. White addicts in wealthy suburbs could access private treatment, detox programs, therapeutic communities. Poor addicts of color were funneled into methadone clinics, where they would remain indefinitely under the watchful eye of institutions that served the state's interest in social control more than the patient's interest in recovery. The pharmaceutical companies profited handsomely. Eli Lilly, Mallinckrodt, and other manufacturers supplied the liquid methadone that clinics dispensed daily. The federal government, through various agencies, paid for it. A captive market, guaranteed by policy, sustained by the machinery of the drug war. Every patient enrolled in methadone maintenance represented ongoing revenue, month after month, year after year, potentially for life. There was no financial incentive to help patients taper off successfully. The business model depended on retention. The regulatory framework that emerged reflected these contradictory purposes. The Drug Enforcement Agency, created in 1973, maintained oversight of methadone as a controlled substance. Clinics faced strict dispensing rules, record-keeping requirements, security protocols. These regulations were ostensibly about preventing diversion, keeping methadone from reaching the black market. But they also reinforced the criminalized nature of addiction treatment, the sense that patients were not to be trusted, that they required constant monitoring and constraint. The DEA, an enforcement agency, became a primary regulator of medical treatment. The symbolism was hard to miss. Patients found themselves caught between two forms of dependency, neither chosen freely. Street heroin meant the chaos of the illegal drug market, the constant scramble for money and supply, the risk of arrest and overdose. But it also meant autonomy, control over when and how much to use, freedom from institutional surveillance. Methadone meant stability, legality, relief from the desperate hunt for drugs. But it also meant submission to a system that controlled their days, monitored their bodies, and offered no clear path to freedom. Because there was no exit plan, methadone maintenance as it was implemented nationally assumed patients would remain in treatment indefinitely, possibly for life. Tapering off methadone was discouraged, considered high risk. The metabolic disease model, Dole and Niswinder's theory, suggested that the body's chemistry had been permanently altered, that abstinence was not realistic. This theory, convenient for a system that profited from attention, became policy. Patients who expressed a desire to stop taking methadone were often counseled against it, told they would relapse, warned at the difficulties of withdrawal. Some were denied the opportunity entirely. The promise had been normalization.
Take methadone and live a normal life, hold a job, maintain relationships, function as a productive member of society. And for some, that promise was fulfilled. There were patients who stabilized on methadone, who rebuilt their lives, who found in the program exactly what Dole and Nicewinder had envisioned. But for many others, the reality was institutionalized dependency, a daily ritual of surveillance and control that was far from any conception of normal life. They were trapped between the street and the clinic, neither fully free nor fully helped, existing in a liminal space where their addiction was managed but never resolved. By 1973, methadone maintenance had become an industry, a bureaucracy, a permanent feature of the American drug policy landscape. What had begun as a small experiment with 22 carefully selected patients had metastasized into a national system serving tens of thousands, with clinics multiplying, regulations proliferating, profits accumulating. The question that had haunted the original program,
Whether lifelong opioid maintenance constituted recovery, had been answered not through medical evidence or ethical deliberation, but through policy and economics. The system decided that indefinite maintenance was success and built an infrastructure to sustain it. But as methadone clinics multiplied across America, something else was multiplying too. Bottles of methadone diverted to the streets, and bodies found cold with state-sanctioned opioids in their blood. But as methadone clinics multiplied across America, something else was multiplying too. Bottles of methadone diverted to the streets, and bodies found cold with state-sanctioned opioids in their blood. The black market methadone trade emerged almost immediately, a predictable consequence that somehow no one in authority had predicted. By the early 1970s, just as the national expansion was reaching its peak, take-home bottles of methadone were appearing on street corners, in shooting galleries, in the hands of dealers who recognized opportunity when they saw it. The economic logic was brutally simple. A patient enrolled in a methadone program, if they had earned the privilege of take-home doses through weeks or months of compliance, might receive several bottles at once. Each bottle represented a day's dose, typically between 60 and 120 milligrams of liquid methadone. On the street, those bottles sold for $5 to $20 each, sometimes more. For someone living in poverty, someone desperate for cash, the math was compelling. Take the dose meant to stabilize your brain chemistry and sell it instead, then return to heroin or suffer through withdrawal until the next clinic visit. But the buyers were not always heroin addicts looking for a substitute. A new population emerged, people who had never touched heroin, who began their opioid journey with diverted methadone. Some were users of other drugs seeking a new high. Some were curious experimenters drawn by methadone's reputation as pharmaceutical grade, safer than street drugs. Some were people in pain, physical or psychological, self-medicating with whatever they could access. The treatment system had created a supply, and the street created demand, and the collision between them produced consequences that methadone's architects had never imagined. Dealers began cutting heroin with methadone, or selling methadone as heroin, capitalizing on the liquid's long duration of action. Users who bought what they thought was heroin might be ingesting methadone without knowing it, a deception that proved deadly because methadone's pharmacology is fundamentally different from heroin's, more dangerous in ways that took years for the public health community to fully comprehend. Methadone's half-life, the time it takes for the body to eliminate half of the drug, ranges from 24 to 36 hours, far longer than heroin's half-life of minutes. This extended duration is precisely what makes methadone useful for maintenance treatment, one dose lasting a full day, preventing the rapid peaks and crashes that define heroin addiction. But this same property makes methadone uniquely lethal. When someone takes heroin, the effects are immediate and intense. Overdose, if it occurs, happens quickly. The user or bystanders have minutes to respond, to call for help, to administer naloxone. With methadone, the respiratory depression that defines opioid overdose can emerge hours after ingestion, long after the person has left the scene of drug use, long after any witnesses have departed. The user feels fine initially, then grows drowsy, then stops breathing, alone, hours later with no one to intervene. Cumulative toxicity created another layer of danger. Someone taking diverted methadone daily, dosing based on intuition rather than medical supervision, might not realize they were accumulating the drug in their system. Each dose added to the previous day's lingering concentration. By day 3 or 4, the combined effect could reach fatal levels, even if no single dose seemed excessive. Overdose symptoms appearing days after repeated dosing, the delayed respiratory depression catching users unaware, their bodies slowly shutting down in a biochemical cascade they could neither see nor stop. Children died. This was perhaps the cruelest irony. Take-home methadone was often dispensed in bottles that were not child-resistant, stored in homes where children lived, left on countertops or in refrigerators, bright orange liquid that looked like juice. A curious toddler, a teenager experimenting, a child simply thirsty and reaching for what appeared to be a beverage. The methadone clinics and regulatory agencies had failed to anticipate this, or had anticipated it and decided the risk was acceptable. The numbers are difficult to reconstruct, but medical examiners through the 1970s documented case after case. Small bodies, accidental ingestion, deaths that were preventable, deaths that occurred because
The system prioritized convenience and cost-cutting over safety. The overdose statistics began to rise, sharply. By the mid-1970s, methadone was appearing with alarming frequency in toxicology reports from fatal overdoses. Sometimes it was the sole cause of death. More often, it was found alongside other substances, alcohol, benzodiazepines, heroin itself, the polydrug combinations that define how people actually use drugs in the real world, mixing and matching in search of relief or oblivion. Medical examiners struggled to attribute causation. Was the methadone the primary killer or a contributing factor? Did it matter? Bodies were accumulating, and methadone was in their blood. The tragic irony was inescapable. The drug that had been introduced specifically to prevent overdose deaths, to stabilize addicts and remove them from the dangers of the illicit drug market, was now causing overdose deaths, creating new populations of users, feeding a black market that generated its own violence and chaos. The solution had created new problems while failing to solve the original one. Heroin use continued, heroin overdoses continued, and now methadone overdoses joined them. State-sanctioned opioids killing people who had never entered a treatment program, who had simply accessed the diverted supply that the system's design had made inevitable. The federal response was predictable and counterproductive. Tighter controls, fewer take-home privileges, more stringent clinic requirements. The Drug Enforcement Administration and Food and Drug Administration issued new regulations through the 1970s and 1980s, each round of rulemaking reducing the circumstances under which patients could receive take-home doses, increasing the monitoring and documentation required, transforming clinics into even more restrictive environments. The logic was crude. Diversion is occurring, therefore access must be restricted. But this logic punished the compliant patients, the ones who were using methadone as prescribed, who had stabilized their lives and needed the flexibility of take-home doses to maintain employment, attend school, care for families. They were forced back to daily clinic visits, their lives reorganized around the institutional schedule, their progress toward normalization reversed. Meanwhile, the restrictions did little to stop diversion. Patients who needed money would find ways to sell their doses regardless of the rules. The black market adapted. Dealers found new suppliers, new distribution networks. The crackdown simply made the illegal trade more profitable by constricting supply, pushing prices higher, incentivizing more risk-taking. And some patients, facing the impossible choice between daily clinic visits they could not maintain and withdrawal they could not endure, turned to the black market themselves, buying illicit methadone to avoid returning to heroin, existing in a shadow zone outside the treatment system entirely. The catch-22 was complete. Stable patients lost privileges because unstable patients were diverting. Unstable patients facing more restrictions became more likely to leave treatment or turn to illegal sources. The system's response to its own failures was to become more restrictive, more punitive, more focused on care rather than care. And with each tightening of the regulatory vice, the truth became clearer. This was never just about health. It was about surveillance, about management, about keeping a problematic population visible and controlled. The community activists who had warned of chemical genocide from the beginning, the Black Panthers and Young Lords who had called methadone a tool of oppression, their prescient warnings were being vindicated. Not because methadone itself was poison, but because the system that dispensed it was designed to control rather than heal, to maintain dependency rather than foster recovery. The diverted drug flooding the black market was simply the most visible symptom of a deeper pathology, the collision of harm reduction rhetoric with the reality of a carceral state that saw addicts as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. By the 1980s, methadone had settled into a grim equilibrium, neither cure nor catastrophe, just permanent management. But then came the next wave. As the bodies piled up from one crisis, the medical establishment was already laying the groundwork for another. This time, they would do it with the best of intentions. They would do it in the name of compassion. In the 1990s, American medicine underwent a philosophical revolution. For decades, doctors had been taught to be cautious with opioids, to reserve them for cancer patients and the terminally ill. But a new movement was gathering force, arguing that this caution had created a different kind of epidemic, an epidemic of untreated suffering. Pain, they insisted, was being systematically undertreated. Patients with chronic back pain, arthritis, fibromyalgia, migraines. Millions of Americans living with persistent discomfort were being denied relief because of outdated fears about addiction. The movement had a slogan, pain as the fifth vital sign. Alongside pulse, blood pressure, temperature, and respiration, doctors should measure and treat pain with the same clinical urgency. In 2001, the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations made pain assessment a requirement for hospital accreditation. The message was clear. Aggressive pain treatment was not just good medicine, it was mandatory.
And so the prescription pads came out. OxyContin led the charge, backed by Purdue Pharma's billions in marketing. But behind the blockbuster drugs, a quieter transformation was happening. Methadone, that Cold War relic, that controversial maintenance drug, was being rediscovered. Not for addiction this time, for pain. The appeal was undeniable. Methadone was cheap, pennies per dose compared to the expensive branded opioids. It was generic, which meant Medicaid and Medicare would cover it without question. It was long-acting, providing relief that could last 8 to 12 hours or more. And it was potent, effective even for severe chronic pain that other opioids couldn't touch. For overwhelmed primary care doctors, for cash-strapped pain clinics, for state Medicare programs desperate to control costs, methadone looked like a miracle. Between 2000 and 2006, methadone prescriptions for pain increased by more than 700%. Not for addiction treatment, for ordinary pain management. Doctors were writing prescriptions for methadone the way they wrote prescriptions for any other pain medication, sending patients home with bottles of pills and standard instructions, take one every 8 hours as needed. But methadone is not like other opioids. It never was. Its pharmacology is uniquely treacherous, and most of the doctors prescribing it had no training in how it behaved in the human body. The critical danger lies in its half-life, the time it takes for the drug to be metabolized and cleared. For most opioids, the analgesic effect and the elimination half-life are roughly matched. When the pain relief wears off, the drug is leaving your system. But methadone's analgesic effect wears off after 6 to 8 hours, while its elimination half-life can be 24 to 36 hours or longer. The pain relief ends, but the drug is still there, accumulating in your tissues, building up with each new dose. This is called dose stocking, and it kills people. Patients would start a new methadone prescription, take their doses as directed, and feel fine for the first few days. On day 3, day 4, day 5, they would go to sleep and never wake up. Their respiratory system would simply shut down, overwhelmed by the cumulative buildup of a drug their doctor thought was safely out of their system. Medical examiners began finding methadone in the bloodstreams of suburban mothers, construction workers, grandmothers with arthritis, people with no history of addiction, people who had filled a legitimate prescription and followed the directions on the bottle. The deaths climbed with horrifying speed. In 1999, methadone was involved in approximately 800 overdose deaths nationwide. By 2006, that number had surged to more than 5,500 annually, a nearly 600% increase in 7 years. And here is the terrible irony. The majority of these deaths were pain patients, not addiction patients. The tightly controlled methadone clinics with their daily observed dosing and strict protocols had safety records that were relatively strong. It was the loosely regulated prescriptions, the bottles of pills sent home with inadequate counseling, that were killing people. 2 parallel universes of methadone existed in America, operating under completely different rules. In one universe, addiction patients came to specialized clinics every morning, drank their dose under supervision, and were slowly tapered under expert care. In the other universe, pain patients filled prescriptions at CVS, took their pills at home unsupervised, and adjusted their doses based on advice from primary care doctors who had never been trained in methadone's unique dangers. The regulatory agencies, the DEA, the FDA, state medical boards, did not coordinate. The lessons learned from decades of addiction treatment were not transferred to the pain management world. The knowledge existed. It simply wasn't shared. By the mid-2000s, the warnings were coming fast and hard. The CDC issued alerts. The FDA added black box warnings to methadone labels. Medical journals published urgent calls to action. Coroners and medical examiners, overwhelmed by the spike in methadone deaths, began speaking publicly about what they were seeing in autopsy rooms across America. But the prescriptions kept coming. The pills kept flowing. The deaths kept climbing. This was not an unpredictable tragedy. This was not some mysterious new drug with
unknown risks. Methadone's dangers had been documented for decades. Its complex pharmacology was well understood by addiction specialists. The potential for respiratory depression, for fatal overdose, for cumulative toxicity, all of this was known. What failed was not the science. What failed was the system. The medical establishment's eagerness to solve the pain crisis, combined with cost pressures and inadequate training, created a perfect storm. And methadone, that drug that was supposed to save people from opioid addiction, was now killing them in their own homes. The bitter irony was almost too much to bear. A substance synthesized to prevent overdose deaths was causing them. A medication designed to keep people alive was putting them in the ground. And the victims were not hardened addicts or careless recreational users. They were people in pain who trusted their doctors, followed their prescriptions, and died anyway. As the bodies piled up and the CDC issued urgent warnings, the medical establishment finally began to reckon with what they had done. But the damage was already generational. Even as methadone's role in the pain crisis diminished, its original purpose would face a reckoning of its own. But first, we must count the dead. The numbers are staggering, but numbers alone cannot convey the scale of what happened. In 2006 and 2007, methadone reached its apex as a killer. Approximately 5,500 Americans died from methadone overdoses each year during this peak period. But here is the statistic that should haunt the medical establishment forever. Methadone was responsible for 1/3 of all prescription opioid deaths in the United States, despite accounting for only 2% of opioid prescriptions. 1 in 3 deaths, 2 in 100 prescriptions. The math is unambiguous. This was not simply an opioid crisis. This was a methadone crisis. Let's give names to the numbers. Kelly Ann Thompson, 27 years old, mother of 2, died on the 5th day of her methadone prescription for chronic back pain. She had never abused drugs. She followed the directions exactly as her doctor prescribed. On day 5, she put her children to bed, lay down beside them, and stopped breathing. Her husband found them in the morning, the children crying, Kelly cold to the touch. Marcus Williams, 42, a construction worker with degenerative disc disease, died in his truck during his lunch break on day 8 of methadone therapy. His coworkers thought he was napping. He had mentioned feeling drowsy, a little foggy, but nothing alarming. The autopsy revealed toxic levels of methadone in his system, accumulated dose by dose until his brainstem simply gave up the work of breathing. Sarah Beth Morrison, 51, a veteran prescribed methadone by a VA doctor for fibromyalgia pain. She died in her sleep on day 6. The coroner found her prescription bottle on the nightstand, pills counted and accounted for. She had not taken extra. She had not sought a high. She had simply taken her medicine and died. These are not outliers. These are patterns. And the pattern reveals a pharmacological betrayal that borders on the criminal. Methadone seemed safe because patients felt normal. They experienced pain relief. They went about their days. There was no euphoria to warn them, no obvious intoxication to signal danger. They took their evening dose, watched television with their families, kissed their children goodnight, and went to sleep. And in the darkness, as they slept, methadone accumulated in their tissues, binding to opioid receptors in the brainstem, suppressing the autonomic drive to breathe. Respiration slowed, oxygen levels dropped, carbon dioxide built up, and then, quietly, without struggle or awareness, they stopped breathing altogether. This is how methadone kills, not dramatically, not obviously, but with a silent, creeping lethality that gives no second chances. The pharmacology is uniquely treacherous in multiple ways. First, there is the respiratory depression, the signature danger of all opioids, but with methadone it is delayed and cumulative. The drug builds up over days, reaching toxic levels just as patients and doctors believe they have found a stable, safe dose. Second, there is QT prolongation. Methadone disrupts the electrical rhythms of the heart, lengthening the QT interval on an electrocardiogram. In some patients, this creates a condition called torsades de pointes, a chaotic, twisting heart rhythm that can cause sudden cardiac death. Patients could be walking, talking, seemingly fine, and then collapse as their heart lost its coordinated beat. Third, there are the drug interactions. Methadone potentiates the effects of other central nervous system depressants in ways that are not simply additive but synergistic. A patient taking methadone with a benzodiazepine for anxiety, or drinking a glass of wine, or taking an over-the-counter sleep aid could inadvertently create a lethal combination. Each substance alone might
be tolerable. Together, they were deadly. And many doctors prescribing methadone did not screen for these interactions, did not ask about other medications, did not warn patients about the dangers of combination use. Then there is what specialists call the titration trap. Chronic pain is dynamic, fluctuating. Doctors, eager to provide relief, would increase methadone doses when patients reported inadequate pain control. But because of methadone's long half-life, the previous doses had not yet fully metabolized. Each increase compounded the accumulation. By the time patients died, their blood levels of methadone were often far higher than the prescribed daily dose would suggest. because they were carrying the weight of weeks' worth of medication in their bodies. In 2006, the CDC launched an investigation into the methadone death spike. Their findings were damning. They identified methadone as a disproportionate killer and issued urgent recommendations: strict dose limits, mandatory prescriber training, enhanced patient counseling, careful monitoring of cardiac function. The FDA responded with a black box warning, the most serious alert the agency can issue, added to methadone labels in 2006. Later, they implemented a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, or REMS, requiring manufacturers to provide education to prescribers. But black box warnings do not jump off the page and stop a doctor's pen. Education programs do not reach the physicians who need them most. Individual states began taking matters into their own hands. Washington State, which had been hit particularly hard, implemented strict limits on methadone prescribing for pain. North Carolina followed suit. Other states issued prescribing guidelines, dose caps, mandatory consultation requirements. The Veterans Administration, facing a methadone death crisis within its own system, issued an internal directive between 2010 and 2012 to drastically reduce methadone prescribing for pain. The message was clear: this drug is too dangerous for routine pain management. And slowly, reluctantly, the prescriptions declined. By 2015, methadone deaths had dropped approximately 50% from their peak. This sounds like a public health victory. It was not. The decline happened because doctors stopped prescribing methadone, not because anyone figured out how to prescribe it safely. The drug itself remained as dangerous as it had always been. The deaths decreased only because exposure decreased. And even with the decline, more than 3,000 Americans were still dying from methadone overdoses annually. 3,000 preventable deaths every single year. This is the heart of the tragedy. All of this was foreseeable. The dangers of methadone were not hidden. They were not newly discovered. Addiction treatment specialists had been managing methadone's complex pharmacology since the 1970s. They knew about the long half-life. They knew about respiratory depression. They knew about cardiac risks and drug interactions. The knowledge existed within one corner of medicine, and it was never adequately communicated to the primary care doctors and pain specialists who began prescribing methadone en masse in the 2000s. The system failed to learn from its own experience, and thousands of people paid with their lives. The families left behind carry a particular kind of grief. There is the loss itself, sudden and often without warning, but there is also the rage, the sense of betrayal. Their loved ones did everything right. They trusted their doctors, they followed their prescriptions, they sought legitimate medical care for legitimate suffering, and they died anyway. Some families filed wrongful death lawsuits, a few won settlements, but no amount of money brings back a mother, a husband, a daughter. And in most cases, there was no clear villain to hold accountable, just a diffuse system failure, a cascade of oversights and miscommunications and unshared knowledge that added up to catastrophe. The medical establishment, when it finally reckoned with the methadone crisis, spoke in the language of lessons learned and updated guidelines and prescriber education. But these sterile phrases cannot capture what really happened. What happened was a public health disaster born of hubris, cost-cutting, and institutional negligence. What happened was that a drug with known, documented dangers was unleashed on an unsuspecting population by doctors who did not understand what they were prescribing. What happened was that thousands of Americans, in pain and seeking relief, were given a medication that quietly, methodically killed them. Even as methadone's role in the pain crisis diminished, its original purpose, addiction treatment, as fentanyl flooded America's streets and overdose deaths exploded to unprecedented levels, methadone would find itself in a new, desperate role. But first, we need to understand what maintenance actually means for the people living it. Picture a life
structured around 6 a.m. every morning, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. No holidays, no vacations, no sleeping in. The alarm goes off in the dark, and you drive to the clinic. You stand in line with the others, some bleary-eyed, some chatty, some still marked by the street life they're trying to leave behind. You approach the window. You give your name. You receive a small plastic cup with your dose, measured precisely to the milligram. You drink it under supervision. The nurse watches. You open your mouth to prove it's gone. Then you leave. Tomorrow, you will do this again, and the day after that, and the day after that. This is methadone maintenance.
For some, it is salvation. For others, it is a different kind of cage. The statistics paint a picture of permanence that few anticipated when methadone maintenance began. The average duration of methadone treatment is 5 to 10 years, but that average obscures the reality. Many patients stay on methadone for 15, 20, 30 years or more. Some have been attending the same clinic since the 1970s, since the program's earliest days. They have grown old in the system. They are lifers. Why can't they stop? The answer lies in methadone's grip on the body. Physical dependency on methadone is profound, more severe in some ways than dependency on heroin itself. Withdrawal from methadone is a prolonged, brutal ordeal. Where heroin withdrawal peaks in 3 to 5 days and largely resolves within a week, methadone withdrawal can last for weeks or even months. The symptoms are severe: bone-deep aching, violent gastrointestinal distress, insomnia so total that patients feel they are losing their minds, depression that crushes the will to continue. Many who attempt to taper off describe it as worse than the heroin withdrawal that drove them to methadone in the first place. The drug that was supposed to free them has bound them more tightly than the substance they were trying to escape. Listen to the testimonies. James, 52 years old, has been on methadone for 23 years. I wanted off heroin, he says. I got off heroin, but now I'm trapped in methadone. I've tried to quit 3 times. I can't do it. The sickness is too much. So here I am every morning like clockwork. Maria, 47, echoes the sentiment. It saved my life. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. But some days I feel like I just traded one master for another. The clinic owns me now instead of the dope man. The daily requirement is not merely inconvenient. It is structurally confining. Methadone patients cannot travel freely, at least not with complex arrangements to guest dose at clinics in other cities, a bureaucratic process that often fails. They cannot miss doses without risking withdrawal. They live under constant surveillance, subject to random urine screens, pill counts, counseling sessions. For some, this structure provides stability, a framework that keeps chaos at bay. For others, it feels like chemical incarceration.
Which allows patients more autonomy, take-home doses, less frequent clinic visits. They ask why methadone maintenance, with its restrictive daily dosing requirements, remains the gold standard when less controlling options exist. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in the tension between these perspectives. For some patients, methadone is exactly what its founders envisioned: a bridge to stability, a tool that allows them to reclaim their lives. For others, it is a new prison, only slightly more humane than the last. And for many, it is both, simultaneously liberating and confining, life-saving and life-limiting. What is missing is not more methadone, but adequate resources for those who want to stop. Tapering protocols that are gradual enough to be tolerable, intensive psychological support during the withdrawal process, residential programs that can manage the extended discomfort, aftercare that prevents relapse once cessation is achieved. These resources exist in theory, but they are rarely funded, rarely accessible, rarely prioritized. It is easier to maintain someone on methadone indefinitely than to support them through the arduous process of getting off. And so the clinics remain full. The lines form every morning. The doses are dispensed. The years accumulate. Some patients find peace in the routine. Others endure it with quiet desperation. And the question remains unanswered. Is this the best we can do? As fentanyl flooded America's streets and overdose deaths exploded to unprecedented levels, methadone found itself in a new, desperate role, the lesser of evils. And so methadone persists, controversial, imperfect, deadly in some hands, life-saving in others. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, we must first reckon with what changed everything: fentanyl. Beginning around 2015, the American overdose crisis entered a new phase of lethality that made everything that came before seem almost quaint by comparison. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid originally designed for surgical anesthesia and end-stage cancer pain, began flooding the illicit drug supply. It is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, 30 to 50 times stronger than heroin. A dose the size of a few grains of salt can kill.
And because it is synthesized in laboratories rather than cultivated in poppy fields, it is cheap, abundant, and horrifyingly easy to distribute. By 2021 and 2022, more than 100,000 Americans were dying from drug overdoses annually. The majority of these deaths involved fentanyl, not heroin laced with fentanyl, but fentanyl itself, pressed into counterfeit pills disguised as Percocet or Xanax, mixed into cocaine and methamphetamine, distributed in powders of wildly inconsistent potency. Users often had no idea they were consuming fentanyl until it was too late. One dose from a batch might produce a mild high. The next dose from the same batch might stop your heart. In this landscape of sudden, unpredictable death, methadone maintenance programs began to look different. Yes, they were restrictive. Yes, they bound people to daily clinic visits and perpetual dependency. But they had one undeniable virtue. People enrolled in methadone programs were not dying from street fentanyl. They were receiving a predictable, measured opioid dose under medical supervision. They were not gambling with their lives every time they used. In a world where the street supply had become a game of Russian roulette, methadone offered something previous generations of critics had overlooked. It offered survival. The public health community began reassessing its relationship with methadone. The critiques did not disappear. The concerns about lifelong dependency, about social control, about the clinic system's limitations, all of that remained valid. But a new moral calculus emerged. Methadone is problematic, but people are not dying from supervised methadone the way they are dying from fentanyl-contaminated drugs. Whatever we think about the ideal treatment, whatever our long-term goals for recovery might be, the immediate priority is keeping people alive, and methadone does that. Then came March 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic. Overnight, the logistics of daily clinic visits became a public health hazard. Crowded waiting rooms, people from high-risk populations gathering in enclosed spaces. The federal government, in a move that shocked longtime observers of addiction policy, issued emergency allowances for take-home methadone doses. Patients who had been required to attend clinic every single day were suddenly given weeks' worth of take-home medication. Restrictions that had been justified for decades as medically necessary were suspended almost casually in the face of a pandemic. And something remarkable happened. Many patients thrived. They reported feeling trusted for the first time. They could hold jobs with irregular hours. They could travel. They could live something closer to normal lives. Overdose rates among methadone patients
not spike catastrophically. Some patients diverted their medication or overdosed from unsupervised use, yes, but these cases were not the norm. The data suggested what harm reduction advocates had been arguing for years. Many of the restrictions on methadone maintenance were punitive rather than medically necessary. They were expressions of distrust, not evidence-based safety measures. But the debate did not resolve cleanly. Traditionalists pointed to the overdoses and diversion that did occur, arguing that relaxed supervision endangered vulnerable patients. Harm reduction advocates countered that the benefits, increased stability, reduced barriers, greater autonomy, far outweighed the risks. The tension exposed a deeper philosophical divide. One side prioritized control and abstinence as ultimate goals. The other side prioritized survival and harm reduction, accepting dependency and maintenance as valid outcomes if they kept people alive. Alternative medications began gaining ground in this shifting landscape. Buprenorphine, marketed as Suboxone, offered many of methadone's benefits with fewer restrictions. It could be prescribed in a doctor's office rather than a specialized clinic. It had a ceiling effect that made overdose less likely. It allowed patients to take medication home from the start. For some, buprenorphine represented the future, more flexible, less stigmatizing, more compatible with normal life. But for others, particularly those with severe long-term opioid dependency, methadone remained more effective. Buprenorphine did not work for everyone. Internationally, other models were emerging. Switzerland's heroin-assisted treatment programs provided pharmaceutical-grade heroin to chronic users under medical supervision, with remarkable success in reducing crime, disease, and death. Canada began piloting safer supply programs, providing regulated opioids to prevent fentanyl exposure. These models challenged American assumptions about what treatment should look like, but they remained politically impossible in the United States, where the punitive impulse still dominated drug policy. In the fentanyl era, the conversation about methadone has shifted from, is this good treatment, to, does this keep people alive long enough to have a future? The answer increasingly is yes. Methadone is not ideal. It is not liberation. It is not the treatment system anyone would design if starting from scratch. But in a world where the alternative is often death, methadone has become a form of mercy.
Not the mercy of cure, but the mercy of survival. Not the mercy of freedom, but the mercy of another day, another chance, another morning to wake up alive. The moral calculus is brutal in its simplicity. Whatever works, whatever keeps people breathing, whatever buys time until something better becomes possible. In the fentanyl crisis, methadone has found its justification not in what it promises, but in what it prevents. And so methadone persists, controversial, imperfect, deadly in some hands, life-saving in others. Which brings us to the question that haunts every conversation about this drug. So what is methadone, really? Strip away the policy jargon, the medical euphemisms, the political rhetoric. Look at what remains. A colorless liquid, a synthetic molecule, a substance that exists because human beings willed it into existence in a fascist laboratory 80 years ago, designed for a war that would consume millions of lives. A drug brought to America as spoils of conquest, repurposed again and again, each generation finding new uses, new justifications, new populations to experiment upon. Methadone is a paradox contained in a bottle. It has saved lives. This is undeniable. There are people alive today, working, raising children, contributing to their communities, who would be dead without methadone maintenance. For them, it is medicine in the truest sense, a substance that transformed chaos into stability, despair into possibility. And methadone has taken lives. This too is undeniable. The pain patients who died days into their prescriptions, their bodies betrayed by a drug they trusted. The diverted doses that ended up in teenagers' hands. The long-term patients whose hearts gave out from years of QT prolongation. The children who found their parents' take-home bottles. Each death preventable. Each death a failure. It has freed people from heroin and trapped them in clinics. It has enabled employment and foreclosed travel. It has reunited families and created new forms of separation. It is harm reduction and social control, often simultaneously, sometimes undistinguishably. It is medicine prescribed by doctors and dependency managed by institutions. These contradictions do not resolve. They coexist, held in tension, contained within a single molecule that seems to reflect back whatever we bring to it. Methadone exposes deeper questions about how we understand addiction, recovery, and our collective relationship to
People who use drugs. Do we see addiction as a chronic disease requiring indefinite medication, like diabetes requiring insulin, or as a crisis, a temporary rupture requiring intervention and healing? Is a person who takes methadone every day for 30 years in recovery or simply in managed dependency? These are not academic questions. They shape policy, determine funding, structure entire systems of care. And we must ask, who benefits from methadone maintenance as it currently exists? Follow the money. Clinics bill insurance indefinitely. Pharmaceutical companies supply the medication perpetually. The system profits from chronic patients, not cured ones. There is no conspiracy here, but the incentives align toward maintenance, not resolution. The institutions benefit from keeping people enrolled, stable, dependent. Is this care or is this management? Is this healing or is this control with a prescription pad? The people remain. Thousands are in methadone programs right now, at this very moment. Some are grateful, describing methadone as the intervention that saved them when nothing else worked. Some feel trapped, yearning for a freedom they cannot quite reach. Most feel both, a complicated gratitude mixed with frustration, acceptance mixed with resentment. Their experiences are not monolithic. Their needs are not identical. And yet the system treats them as if one size fits all, as if the same rigid structure serves everyone equally. The dead remain too, in memory and in consequence. Every pain patient who died from a poorly managed prescription, every diverted dose that ended a young life, every long-term maintenance patient whose years of methadone use culminated in cardiac arrest. They are part of this story. They demand to be counted. And this story is not over. It is not history in the past tense. Right now, as you listen to these words, someone is walking into a methadone clinic for the first time. Someone is receiving their morning dose. Someone is trying to taper off and failing. Someone is alive because of methadone. Someone is dying because of it. The narrative continues, unresolved, contested,
as messy and complicated as the human condition itself. Perhaps the question is not what methadone is. Perhaps the question is what we are willing to accept. We created this molecule in a laboratory built by fascism to fuel a war machine. We brought it to America as spoils of conquest. We repurposed it to manage a drug crisis born of our own prohibition policies. We have used it to control populations, to manage epidemics, to substitute one dependency for another. And now, 8 decades later, we cannot seem to let it go. Methadone is a mirror. It reflects our choices, our priorities, our willingness to settle for management instead of healing, for control instead of care. It asks us what we believe people who use drugs deserve. It asks us what kind of society we want to be. The bottle sits on the clinic counter, colorless, measured, containing multitudes, hope and despair, life and death, liberation and bondage, all of it at once. The question remains,